This video is to help you do step number 5 of the focusing activity, assessing the learning in your student learning outcome. And there's basically 2 steps. First, choose the appropriate assessment task that's going to match and align with the student learning outcome action verb that you created in the last step. To think about assessment in terms of behavior, there's only 3 things a student can do in your class. They can write something down, they can speak, or they can do something. That's about it. So out of your action verb, what do you think would create the best evidence to demonstrate that students learn? So let's look at our example. At the end of the lesson, a successful student will be able to identify and evaluate elements of a good teacher in the context of him or herself. So let's look at the first action verb, identify. Which of these 3 above here would give you the best evidence that the student can identify: writing, speaking, or performance? And because this is a low-level Bloom's taxonomy word that represents very simple understanding, we could definitely use a simple writing or speaking task that will give us evidence that the student learned. We don't have to get complicated for that particular one. However, evaluate's a little more complex. So we could do the same writing and speaking task, but make sure it's a little more complex because we're going to need much more evidence that the understanding is occurring in that student. Notice something like a performance task as students role-playing. It's probably not the best way to gather evidence of their ability to identify and evaluate, because performance tasks are geared towards doing and showing. If the opposite were true, if we did have a SLO with doing and showing, then we could argue that role-playing would be wonderful here. Notice that we're aligning what the action is with the assessment. So as long as your assessment provides you with clear evidence of students' ability to identify and evaluate characteristics of good teachers in the context of him or herself, or whatever your SLO is, then you can use it. So there's not a rule that says an assessment is no good. It's just that it may not be very good at assessing or showing you enough evidence, and you'll need to find another one. This is a great argument against standardized testing in schools, and we'll digress for just a second here, because many folks argue that a multiple choice test that they use for No Child Left Behind really doesn't provide enough evidence for students to demonstrate the full learning that's going on in school, and it cannot be used as the main criteria for whether schools are successful. So this is a great argument that you can use. Do you think schools should use other assessments that are more aligned with the learning behaviors that students demonstrate in class? And should those new assessments or alternative assessments be used in No Child Left Behind? Okay. Because we certainly want to measure what students really know. Notice this is at this time it's not important to know the exact specific about the assessment task yet. We'll get that when we talk about the instructional activities. All you need to know is that this task will involve one of those behaviors, and in this case, writing. Once you've set the task, now you have to do number 2, is determine what criteria you will need to make sure that those students have learned. So depending on you could use a multiple choice test with a key if it fits your student learning outcome. In this case, we're going to use a writing. And a lot of times the way we evaluate writing is through a rubric. So if you need help writing a rubric or need text and web resources for that, click on this standards-based lesson plan assessment section and it will help you with that assessment task criteria. So here's what I decided would be a great measurement of identifying evaluation. I have a list of good characteristics that, if a student can list a whole bunch, that exceeds the SLO that I want. If they can do 8 to 7, then they will meet the SLO. Only 6 to 5, then they're approaching, and only below 4, then they're not reaching the criteria that I set. Same with your own personal characteristics of yourself as a teacher. 10 to 9, well above, and so on. Notice that each characteristic is the same for each category, except it changes slightly. Then for the evaluation part, if you can compare these 2 lists together, then you might be able to judge whether or not you're meeting those lists as your own growth as a teacher. So if you compare one characteristic in depth with a specific example, that exceeds the SLO for evaluation. And if it's with a vague example, that meets it, and so on. And in this way, I will now get evidence that you can identify and evaluate good characteristics in a teacher and compare it to yourself. Okay? You want to do the same thing with yours. Okay. That's it.